The dust of Dry Creek tasted like regret. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated a man's tongue, settled in the lines of his face, and worked its way into the very fabric of his soul. Eli McCall tasted it the moment he rode his weary buckskin down the town's single. Sorry excuse for a street. He had been on the trail for 4 months, pushing a sea of longhorn cattle north from the scorched lands of Texas. The work was hard, the sun was unforgiving, and the nights were lonely. But there was an honesty to it. The cattle did not judge, the stars did not gossip, and the prairie did not lie. Dry Creek, however, felt like a nest of lies from the outset. The town was little more than a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings leaning against each other for support, like tired old men sharing a bottle. The saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office, and a sad-looking church with a crooked steeple made up the bulk of it. Porches sagged. Windows were grimed with the same dust that plagued the air. There was a bitterness here, an edge of desperation that Eli had seen in other frontier towns that were either dying or had never truly learned how to live. He swung down from his horse, his joints groaning in protest, and tied the reins to a hitching post that looked as tired as he felt. His body ached with the deep, settled weariness of a man who had spent too long in the saddle. But it was his spirit that felt the heavier burden. He was searching for something he could not quite name, a quiet corner of the world where the ghosts of his past might finally leave him be. He was not looking for trouble. In fact, he had spent the better part of the last 5 years avoiding it. Men watched him from the shadows of the covered boardwalks. Their eyes were narrow, assessing him with a silent, simmering hostility reserved for strangers. Women, gathering supplies at the general store, paused their conversations to whisper behind their hands, their gazes flicking toward him like startled birds. In Dry Creek, it seemed the law was not enforced by the badge on the sheriff's chest, but by the collective weight of 100 judgmental stares. Prejudice was the town's most abundant crop, and it grew thick and thorny under every porch. Eli ignored them, his face a stoic mask he had perfected over the years. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder from years of hard labor, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow. His eyes, a pale, clear blue, had seen too much violence to be easily surprised, and his hands, calloused and capable, rested easy at his sides, never far from the worn grip of the Colt revolver holstered on his hip. He was not a man who invited conversation, and his quiet demeanor was often mistaken for a threat, when in truth, it was a shield. He found his way to the livery, the scent of hay and horse a welcome comfort. An old friend, Silas Croft, ran a small ranch a few miles out of town. It was Silas who had sent word that there was work for a man who knew cattle and was not afraid of a long night's watch. Eli had ridden with Silas years ago, before the war had ripped the country and their lives apart. He found Silas shoeing a horse, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel a steady, honest sound in the suffocating quiet of the town. Silas was older now, his hair a shock of white and his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his grip was still firm when he shook Eli's hand. "McCall," he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Figured that was you. You look like you've been rode hard and put away wet." "Something like that," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "Good to see you, Silas." "And you," Silas finished hammering the shoe into place and straightened up, rubbing the small of his back. "Got a bunk for you out at the ranch. Simple, but it's dry. The missus will be glad for another hand to feed. Says she gets tired of looking at my ugly face." Eli managed a small smile. "What's the trouble? Your letter was short on details." Silas's expression soured. "Rustlers, bold ones, picking off a few head at a time, just enough to make a man furious, but not enough to start a war over. The sheriff," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the town, "is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Spends most of his time settling disputes over who looked at whose wife the wrong way." "So you need a guard," Eli concluded. "I need a man I can trust," Someone who knows which end of a cow gets up first and which end of a gun to point. The bunk and board are yours as long as you want them. Just help me keep what's mine." It was a fair offer. It was exactly what Eli had been looking for. Honest work, a place to rest his head, and a reason to be somewhere that was not nowhere. He accepted with a nod. And for the first time in months, a small measure of the tension in his shoulders began to ease. He spent the rest of the day helping Silas with chores, the simple, mindless work, a balm to his restless mind. He would stay out at the ranch, avoiding the poisoned atmosphere of the town as much as possible. He would do his job, earn his keep, and move on when the time was right. It was a simple plan. It was a good plan. But the best-laid plans of men often unravel at the first sign of another's suffering. That night, after a solid meal at Silas's table, Eli rode back into town for a few provisions. The sun had bled out across the horizon, leaving the sky bruised purple and black. Lanterns cast a sickly yellow glow onto the dusty street, and the tinny, cheerful sound of a piano spilled from the saloon's bat-wing doors, a stark contrast to the town's daytime gloom. As he was tying his horse outside the general store, he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost lost beneath the raucous laughter from the saloon. It was the sound of weeping, not loud or hysterical, but a choked, muffled sobbing that spoke of a pain so deep it had exhausted itself. Curiosity, an instinct he normally kept firmly in check, got the better of him. He followed the sound, his boots silent in the dust, around the side of the saloon and into the narrow, stinking alley behind it. The air was thick with the stench of stale beer and refuse. And there, huddled against the rough-hewn planks of the back wall, was a girl. She was sitting in the mud, her thin dress soaked and stained. Her feet were bare, her shoes lying in tatters beside her, the soles worn completely through. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark blonde, hung over her face, but he could see the tremors that racked her small frame. Her shoulders shook with each suppressed sob. Her eyes, when she finally looked up as his shadow fell over her, were swollen and red, set in a face that was pale and smudged with dirt. She could not have been more than 17 or 18, a mere slip of a thing to be bearing such a heavy weight of sorrow. Before he could speak, 2 men stumbled out of the saloon's back door, their laughter loud and cruel. They saw the girl and their amusement curdled into contempt. "Well, look what we got here," one of them sneered, his words slurred by drink. "The little church mouse, playing in the mud." The other man hawked and spat, the glob landing dangerously close to her bare feet. "She ain't no church mouse no more. She's filth, is what she is, just like the rest of them in the cat house." The girl flinched as if struck, pulling her knees tighter to her chest, making herself smaller. She did not speak, did not defend herself. She just endured, her silence a canvas onto which they painted their vile accusations. "Go on, get out of here, you little whore," the first man said, giving her a shove with the toe of his boot. It was not a hard kick, but it was filled with malice. Eli's hand instinctively went to his gun, his fingers curling around the familiar grip. A cold, quiet anger settled over him. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, in the war, in other broken towns. He hated it. He hated the way it preyed on the weak, the way it fed on itself until it consumed everything good. The men, sensing his presence, turned to face him. Their drunken bravado wavered slightly as they took in his size, the stillness of his posture, and the cold fire in his eyes. "What you looking at, stranger?" one of them challenged, though his voice lacked conviction. Eli did not answer. He just held their gaze, his silence more potent than any threat. After a moment that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity, the men grumbled, exchanged a nervous glance, and shuffled off down the alley, disappearing into the darkness. He was alone with the girl again. The sound of her weeping had stopped, replaced by a tense, frightened silence. He could feel her watching him, her fear a palpable thing in the air between them. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy trail coat. the one that had protected him from countless storms and cold nights. It was worn and smelled of leather, dust, and man, but it was warm. He stepped forward and held it out to her. "Here." The girl recoiled, scrambling back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. She flinched, a sharp, violent jerk of her head, as if she expected a blow to land at any second. The gesture hit Eli harder than any fist. He had seen that kind of fear in spooked horses, in animals caught in a trap. He had never seen it in a girl so young. It told a story of its own, a story of pain and betrayal that made the men's insults seem almost trivial. He stopped, holding the coat out, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and even. "It's a cold night. You should take it." He placed the coat on a dry crate a few feet away from her, then took a step back, giving her space. For a long time, she just stared at it, then at him, her chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. Finally, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and pulled the coat toward her, wrapping it around her shaking shoulders. It engulfed her small frame, a shield of worn wool against the world's contempt. "What is your name?" he asked gently. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, cracked and dry from crying. "Clara. Just a name, a simple, clean sound in a dirty alley." He nodded. "Eli?" He did not know what else to say. He was not a man skilled in the art of comfort. He dealt in actions, not words. He watched as she pulled the coat tighter, her face hidden in its collar. He noticed the stable just across the alley, its loft door slightly ajar. He had a sudden, sinking feeling he knew where she had been sleeping. The townspeople did not just scorn her. They had cast her out entirely. Leaving her to fend for herself like a stray dog, they avoided her like she carried the plague. A knot of something cold and hard formed in his gut. This was not his fight. He did not want it to be. He had come to Dry Creek for quiet, not to champion the cause of a girl branded a sinner by an entire town, but he could not just walk away. Not completely. He turned without another word and went into the general store. The storekeeper, a balding man with shifty eyes, watched him with open curiosity. Eli ignored him, picking up a fresh loaf of bread and a block of cheese. He paid for them and walked back out into the night. He returned to the alley, but Clara was gone. For a moment, he thought she had vanished, but then he saw a flicker of movement in the shadows near the stable. The crate where he had left his coat was empty. He walked over to the stable entrance and placed the bread and cheese on a bale of hay just inside the door, where she would find it. Then he turned and walked away, his heart heavy with a disturbance he could not shake. He was disturbed by her deafening silence, by the raw terror in her eyes, and by the vicious, self-righteous cruelty of the people in this town. He mounted his horse and rode back to the ranch. The image of the girl huddled in the mud burned into his mind. A few days later, Eli was in the saloon, nursing a single beer. He rarely drank, but the long hours of patrol were beginning to wear on him, and he needed something to cut through the dust in his throat. The place was crowded, filled with the same hard-faced men he saw on the street every day. The barkeep, a man named Henderson with a thick mustache and an even thicker neck, polished a glass as he spoke to Eli. "Saw you out back the other night with the girl." Eli did not respond, just took a slow sip of his beer. Henderson leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You are new here, so I will give you some friendly advice. Stay clear of that one. She is poison." "Is that so?" Eli said, his voice flat. "It is," the barkeep affirmed, nodding sagely. "Used to be a real pious one, that Clara Bell. Went to church every Sunday. Head bowed, quiet as a mouse. Lived with the preacher, Reverend Miller, an orphan. He took her in. Then one night, about a month ago, she was seen, sneaking out the back door of the cat house down the street, right as the sun was coming up. Never went back to the church after that. The Reverend, he disowned her. said she was a temptress, a Jezebel, corrupted by sin. Henderson straightened up, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "She is ruined," he declared, as if delivering a final verdict. "No decent person in this town will have anything to do with her." Eli listened to the story, his expression unreadable. He thought of the flinch. He thought of the torn shoes and the silent, desperate sobs. He thought of a young girl sleeping in a stable loft because there was nowhere else for her to go. The barkeep's story was neat and tidy. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It explained everything, but it did not feel true. Something about it felt hollow, rehearsed, like a tale told so many times it had taken on a life of its own, regardless of the facts. He did not believe it. Not in his gut. His gut told him there was more to the story, a darker, uglier truth that the town was unwilling to see. But believing her and getting involved were two different things. He was a stranger here. He had no standing, no say in their affairs. To defend her would be to make himself a target. It would mean trouble, and trouble was the one thing he had sworn to avoid. He finished his beer, set the empty glass on the bar, and dropped a coin beside it. "Thanks for the advice," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He walked out of the saloon, leaving the barkeep to his gossip and his certainty. That night, the sky broke open. A storm rolled in from the west, a great, angry beast of a thing. Wind howled through the cracks in the bunkhouse walls, and rain lashed against the roof in a furious torrent. Thunder cracked like a whip, and flashes of lightning illuminated the drenched landscape in stark, ghostly detail. Eli lay on his cot, listening to the storm's fury. He should have been able to sleep. He was tired, his muscles sore from a long day of riding the fence line. He was dry and warm, but sleep would not come. His mind kept drifting back to the alley, to a girl with swollen eyes and a whispered name. He pictured the stable, the loft with its open door. He wondered if the roof leaked. He wondered if the wind was blowing the rain straight in. He wondered if she was cold, if she was scared, if she had any shelter at all from the violence of the storm. He closed his eyes and tried to force the image from his mind. It was not his concern. He had given her his coat. He had bought her food. He had done more than anyone else in this rotten town. It was enough. It had to be. But as another crash of thunder shook the bunkhouse to its foundations, he knew it was not enough. He could not lie here, safe and warm, while she was out there, alone in the tempest. His conscience, a thing he had long tried to silence, was speaking to him now, its voice as loud and insistent as the roaring wind. He sat up, the thin mattress creaking under his weight. He stared into the darkness, his jaw tight. He had come to Dry Creek for peace, but it seemed peace was not to be found here. Not for him. Not while a barefoot girl was left to face the storm alone. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent spirit that tore at the world with invisible claws. Eli McCall felt it push against him and his horse as they fought their way back toward Dry Creek. Rain fell in cold, hard sheets, plastering his hair to his skull and streaming down his face. Each flash of lightning bleached the landscape white, revealing a world thrashing in the storm's grip. He was a fool. He knew it. A fool for turning back. A fool for letting a stranger's plight get under his skin. But the image of Clara huddled in the mud, the echo of her choked sobs, was a burr in his mind that he could not shake loose. He rode straight for the stable behind the saloon, the building a dark, hulking shape against the violent sky. Dismounting, he tied his horse under the meager protection of an overhang and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The familiar scent of hay and animals was thick in the air, a small pocket of life amidst the storm's chaos. It was dark inside, the only light coming from the lightning that flickered through the cracks in the walls. "Clara!" he called out, his voice low but carrying in the enclosed space. There was no answer. Only the frantic drumming of rain on the roof and the nervous shifting of the horses in their stalls. He felt his way toward the ladder leading to the loft. his hand brushing against the bale of hay where he had left the food. The bread and cheese were gone. She was here. He pulled himself up into the loft. The wind was stronger up here, whistling through the gaps in the planking. A large section of the roof was clearly damaged, allowing rain to pour in, soaking the hay in one corner. And in that corner, he found her. She was curled into a tight ball, wrapped in his trail coat, which was now soaked through. She was shivering, but it was a violent, uncontrolled tremor that had nothing to do with the cold alone. He knelt beside her, the hay squelching under his knee. He reached out and touched her forehead. Her skin was burning, a fierce, dry heat that spoke of a raging fever. "Clara," he said again, his voice softer this time. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, clouded with sickness. She tried to scramble away from him, a weak, panicked movement, but a fit of coughing seized her, leaving her gasping and limp. She could not stand. She could barely lift her head. If he left her here, the fever and the cold would kill her before morning. The thought settled in his gut with the cold, hard weight of certainty, against every instinct for self-preservation, against his better judgment and his deep-seated desire to remain uninvolved. He knew what he had to do. He could not leave her to die. "I am going to help you," he said, his words firm and steady, hoping the tone would cut through her delirium. "I am taking you somewhere dry." He slid his arms under her, one beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail, as if she were made of little more than bird bones and sorrow. The moment he lifted her, a choked cry of terror escaped her lips. She began to struggle, her weak hands pushing against his chest, her body stiff with fear. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged breath. "Please, no." "Hush now," he murmured, holding her securely against his chest. "I am not going to harm you. I am taking you out of the rain." Her resistance was born of pure, instinctual terror. It was the frantic, desperate struggle of a trapped animal. But the fever had stolen her strength. After a moment, her protests faded, and she went limp in his arms, her head falling against his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, punctuated by shivers that racked her small frame. He could feel the heat of her fever even through his wet shirt. Carrying her was a clumsy business. He navigated the ladder with care, his muscles straining. Once on the stable floor, he strode out into the storm. He untied his horse, who sidestepped nervously at the clap of thunder, and somehow managed to swing himself into the saddle with Clara held tight in one arm. He wrapped the reins around his hand, nudged the horse into a walk, and turned away from the town, toward the sprawling darkness of Silas Croft's land. There was an old line shack on the far edge of the property, miles from the main ranch house. It had not been used in years, a relic from a time when the ranch was larger and the cattle grazed farther out. It was small, isolated, and most importantly, it had a solid roof and a stone fireplace. It was the only place he could think of to take her, a place where they would not be seen, where she could be safe from the town's prying eyes and the storm's fury. The ride was a grim ordeal. The rain was relentless, and the wind tried to tear them from the saddle. Eli hunched over, shielding Clara's body with his own, his jaw set against the cold. She did not stir, her stillness a dead weight in his arms. He feared she had lost consciousness, or worse. Finally, a dark shape emerged from the gloom. The line shack. He slid from the horse, his legs stiff and cold, and carried her inside. The air was musty and cold, but it was dry. He gently laid her down on the dusty floor before the hearth, then went back out to unsaddle his horse and lead it into a small lean-to attached to the shack. He worked quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. He found a pile of dry wood stacked against the back wall and soon had a small fire crackling in the hearth. The flames pushed back the damp and the dark, casting a warm, flickering light over the single room. He found a rusty bucket and an old tin cup, which he rinsed as best he could with the rain pouring from the roof's edge. He found a tattered but dry horse blanket folded on a shelf. He brought the blanket over and tucked it around her, careful not to be rough. She was still shivering, her teeth chattering. He needed to get her warm, but the thought of removing her wet clothes was one he would not entertain. Her dignity was all she had left, and he would not be the one to take it from her. Instead, he built up the fire until it was roaring, the heat radiating out into the room. All through the long night, he sat by her side, a silent sentinel. He dipped a strip torn from his own shirt into the bucket of rainwater and used it to bathe her forehead, trying to bring the fever down. He coaxed small sips of water between her cracked lips, most of which dribbled down her chin. He listened to her ragged breathing, to the fevered, nonsensical words she sometimes mumbled in her delirium. He heard names he did not know and phrases that spoke of fear and pleading. He did not try to understand them. It was not his place. His only job was to keep her alive until the sun came up. Sometime in the gray, washed-out hours before dawn, the storm passed and the rain softened to a gentle patter, and with the storm, her fever broke. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, settled stillness. The heat receded from her skin, leaving it cool and slick with sweat. He felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. She would live. He must have drifted off, slumped in a sitting position against the wall, because the next thing he knew, the shack was filled with the pale light of a new day. He opened his eyes and saw that Clara was awake. She was sitting up, clutching the horse blanket to her chest, and staring at him. The glassy look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a sharp, lucid terror. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar shack, then back to him. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the blanket. He saw the question in her eyes, the panic, the terrible, sickening assumption of what must have happened while she was unconscious. She thought he had taken advantage of her, that this small kindness came with a price. "Did you?" she started, her voice a hoarse croak. She could not finish the sentence. Eli saw the shame and fear warring on her face. He did not say a word. He did not try to reassure her or explain. He simply stood up, his joints protesting, and walked out of the shack, closing the door softly behind him. He left her with her safety, her dignity, and the undeniable proof that he expected nothing in return. He spent the next few days in a state of quiet vigilance. He kept his distance, but he did not abandon her. Each morning, he would ride out to the shack and leave a portion of his own breakfast and a bucket of fresh water on the porch. In the evening, he would do the same with his supper. He brought her a bar of soap from the general store, a clean cloth, and a comb. He asked no questions. He never tried to go inside. He would leave the supplies, wait until he saw her shadow move to retrieve them, and then ride away. Slowly, cautiously, a routine formed. One day, he left a small stack of old books he had found in the ranch house. The next, she left the empty bucket on the porch for him to refill, a silent acknowledgement, a request. She began to speak to him, but only when necessary. "Thank you," she would whisper from behind the door as he set down a plate of food. "You need to eat," he would reply, his voice a low rumble. And that was all. It was an arrangement built on silence and space. And in that silence, something fragile and tentative began to grow. Trust. One afternoon, nearly a week after the storm, he arrived to find her sitting on the shack's small porch, combing out her damp hair in the sun. She was wearing his trail coat, the sleeves rolled up. She looked thin, her face still pale, but the sickness was gone. When she saw him, she did not retreat inside. She stayed where she was, her hands stilling in her hair. He dismounted and set down a small parcel of food. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing. It was she who broke the silence. "My name is Clara Bell," she said, as if formally introducing herself. "Eli McCall," he replied. She looked down at her hands. "I came from the preacher's home. Reverend Miller." He nodded, waiting. "He said he was a man of God," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "But his hands were heavy. His rules were suffocating." She paused, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the old terror in her eyes. "I have no family, no one else." He saw it then, on her arm, as the coat sleeve slipped down, a series of faint, discolored marks on her wrist, bruises so old they had faded to a sickly yellow green, the ghost of a grip, of fingers that had squeezed too tight. The bruises spoke of a cruelty that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with a man's temper. They explained the flinch. "He told everyone I ran away because I was wicked," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He told them I sold myself, but I never did." She looked up at him then, her gaze direct and desperate, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I swear to you, Mr. McCall, I am not what they say I am. I am still—" She could not say the word, but he understood. "I know," he said. And the thing was, he did. He believed her without reservation. There was an innocence about her, a deep and wounded purity that the town's ugly gossip could not touch. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "Why do you believe me?" "Because I have seen men like your preacher before," he said, his voice flat. "And I have seen girls like you." From that day on, she began to heal in more than just body. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede. She still did not smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased. She would talk to him a little more each day, sharing small, inconsequential things about the world, but never again about the preacher's house. He did not push. He let her set the pace. His frequent trips to the abandoned shack, however, had not gone unnoticed. In a town like Dry Creek, secrets were a currency, and a stranger spending time with the town pariah was a secret worth a fortune in gossip. Men at the saloon would watch him with knowing smirks. Silas's wife, a kind but nervous woman, began to look at him with worry in her eyes. One evening, as Eli was oiling his saddle in the barn, one of the other ranchers, a big, loud man named Jedediah Stone, cornered him. Stone had a face like a slab of raw meat and an attitude to match. "McCall," he said, his voice laced with a smug, condescending tone. "Been seeing you ride out toward the old line shack a lot, getting pretty friendly with the little sinner. Are we?" Eli continued his work, his movements slow and deliberate. "That is my business. Stone." Stone chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Look, I am just giving you a warning. Men do not protect whores unless they are using them. That is just the way of things. If you are getting your fill, fine, but do not go pretending it is something it is not. A girl like that, she will only bring you trouble." Eli stopped what he was doing. He set down the oil rag very carefully. He turned to face Stone, his body coiling with a cold, controlled fury he had not felt in years. The man's words, his casual, demeaning assumption, the way he reduced Clara to a thing to be used. It was the voice of the entire town, distilled into one foul sentence. It was the same poison that had left her shivering in the mud, the same cruelty that had almost killed her. He did not say a word. He simply drew back his fist and punched Jedediah Stone squarely in the face. It was a solid, satisfying crack of bone on bone. Stone staggered back, surprise and pain warring in his eyes, a stream of blood gushing from his nose. He fell into a pile of hay, sputtering curses. Eli stood over him, his knuckles throbbing, his chest heaving. He had broken his own rule. He had gotten involved. He had picked a fight that was not his. But as he looked at the bloodied, sputtering man on the ground, he felt no regret, only a grim sense of finality. He had drawn a line in the dust of Dry Creek. He turned and walked away, leaving Stone to his pain and his indignation. He knew the punch would have consequences. Word would spread. The whispers would grow louder. The smirks would turn to glares. The town, which had already been cold, would now turn to ice. He had made an enemy of them all. He had made Clara's fight his own. The punch echoed in the silence of Eli's life for days. It was not the act itself. He had known violence far more intimate and final, but the consequence of it. He had stepped out from the shadows of his own quiet existence and into the harsh, unforgiving light of Dry Creek's judgment. When he rode into town now, the whispers did not just follow him. They preceded him. A wave of scorn that parted the dusty air. Men who had once given him a curt nod now stared straight through him. The women clutched their children a little closer, their faces pinched with disapproval. He had defended the sinner, and in their eyes, the stain of her supposed sin had spread to him. He did not care, or rather, he told himself he did not care. The part of him that craved peace and anonymity railed against his decision, but the part that had looked into Clara's terrified eyes knew he could have done nothing else. Out at the line shack, a different kind of world was taking shape, one built not on judgment but on the slow, careful laying of one stone of trust upon another. Clara was healing. The gaunt, haunted look was receding, replaced by a softness that settled in her features when she thought he was not looking. Color was returning to her cheeks, a faint blush of rose against pale skin. She ate the food he brought without reservation now, her appetite a small but certain sign of life returning. She spoke more, her voice still quiet but losing its brittle, whisper-thin edge. She told him of the wildflowers that grew in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek, of the way a hawk circled in the high, blue emptiness of the sky. She never spoke of the preacher, never mentioned the dark chapter of her life that had ended in the mud behind the saloon. It was a locked room in her heart, and Eli had no intention of trying the door. He let her lead them into the light. One afternoon, he was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. He was clumsy, his mind elsewhere, and as he swung the axe, he missed the log and the handle slipped from his sweaty grasp. The axe head buried itself in the dirt with a dull thunk, and the handle flew up, spinning end over end before clattering harmlessly to the ground a few feet away. It was a foolish, amateurish mistake. He stood there for a moment, staring at the axe handle as if it had personally betrayed him. And then he heard it. It started as a small sound, a little hitch in her breath from the porch where she was mending a tear in his shirt. Then it grew, a light, airy bubble of sound that seemed impossibly bright in the grim landscape of their lives. She was laughing, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that made her shoulders shake and brought tears to her eyes. The sound struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. It was like hearing music for the first time after years of deafness. It was the sound of a soul that had not been broken, only bent. A deep, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost did not recognize it. It was a kind of joy. His heart, a thing he had long considered little more than a tough, scarred muscle for pumping blood, gave a painful, hopeful stir. He hid it immediately, turning his back to her and pulling the axe from the dirt with a grunt, pretending to be annoyed with his own clumsiness. He did not want her to see the effect her laughter had on him. He did not want to frighten it away, to make her self-conscious. He wanted only to hear it again. That evening, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal, beautiful strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The heat of the day was bleeding away, replaced by a cool evening breeze that rustled the dry grass. They sat on the porch of the shack, sharing a comfortable silence, watching the colors fade. Clara had been quiet for a long time, her hands clasped in her lap. Finally, she turned to him, her face bathed in the soft, dying light. Her eyes were serious, filled with a question that seemed to weigh on her. "Eli," she began, her voice soft, "why are you kind to me? No one else? No one has ever—" She trailed off, unable to finish. He looked away from her, out at the vast, darkening prairie. He thought of all the reasons he could give her. He could talk about right and wrong, about decency, about the simple human duty to help someone in need. But those were just words, thin and hollow. The truth was simpler and far more personal. He turned back to face her, his gaze steady. "Because you did not deserve what was done to you," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "Whatever it was, you did not deserve it." It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging her past, to acknowledging the bruises he had seen and the terror he had witnessed. He was not just offering her food and shelter. He was offering her validation. He was telling her that her pain was real, and it was unjust. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Her lips parted slightly. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and laid her hand on his. His hand was calloused and rough from years of leather reins and splintered wood. Hers was small and soft, but there was a surprising warmth in her touch. The contact was electric. It was the first time she had ever touched him willingly, the first time she had initiated any contact at all. A jolt went through him, sharp and fierce, a current of feeling that traveled up his arm and settled deep in his chest. He did not move. He barely breathed. Her eyes filled with tears. But these were not the tears of fear or sorrow he had seen in the alley. These were tears of release, of gratitude so profound it could not be held in words. They spilled over and traced shining paths down her cheeks in the twilight. She did not pull her hand away. She just let it rest there on his, a silent, trembling bridge between two lonely souls. They stayed like that until the last light had faded from the sky and the first stars began to prick the darkness. Their life together found a quiet rhythm. They shared a fire each night, the flames a crackling. Living presence in the small shack. He would often find her watching the flames, her expression thoughtful, as if she were seeing something in their dance that he could not. He gave her the single cot to sleep on, a lumpy mattress stuffed with old straw, while he took the horse blanket and slept on the floor by the door. He was a light sleeper, and he wanted to be the first thing anyone would encounter if trouble came calling. He never tried to touch her. He never made an advance, never even hinted at wanting more than she was prepared to give. He gave her space, respect, and the unwavering certainty that she was safe with him. It was a gift more precious than gold. One morning, he brought out his Colt revolver. He laid it on the small, rick-backed table on the porch, along with a box of cartridges. Clara looked at the weapon, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I am going to teach you how to use this," he said simply. I have never held a gun before," she stammered. "I know," he said. "That is why you need to learn. The world is not a kind place. Clara, I cannot always be here to protect you. You need to be able to protect yourself." He showed her how to hold it, his large hands guiding hers, his touch impersonal and instructive. He felt the tremor in her fingers as she took the heavy weight of the gun. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 feet away. Her first shot went wide, the explosive crack of the gun making her jump and cry out, but she did not drop it. She set her jaw, took a deep breath, and tried again, and again. She was a natural. Her hand was steady. Her eye was true. By the end of the morning, she could hit the can 3 times out of 5. A fierce, determined look had replaced the fear in her eyes. It was the look of a survivor. As she handed the gun back to him, he saw a flicker of pride in her face, and it was more beautiful than any sunset. But while their small world was finding its balance, the world outside was tilting further into hostility. The story of his fight with Jedediah Stone had spread like a prairie fire, embellished with every telling. Now, the town saw him not just as a sinner's accomplice, but as a violent drifter, a troublemaker. Silas Croft, his friend and employer, finally confronted him one evening in the barn. The old rancher looked weary, his face etched with worry. Eli, he began, not meeting his eyes, you have put me in a difficult position. People are talking. Jedediah is telling everyone you attacked him for no reason. They are saying you are keeping that girl out at the line shack for your own purposes. Eli continued to brush down his horse, his movements steady. And what do you believe, Silas? Silas sighed, a heavy, rattling sound. I have known you a long time. I do not believe you are the man they say you are. But I have a wife, a ranch to run. The other ranchers, they are putting pressure on me. They say if I harbor a man like you, they will not help me at Roundup. They will not trade with me. Dry Creek is a small place. You cannot make an enemy of everyone and expect to survive. So you are telling me to leave? Eli said, his voice flat. It was not a question. I am telling you that you have to choose, Silas corrected, his voice pained. Get rid of the girl, send her on her way, and this will all blow over. But if you keep protecting her, I will have to ask you to leave my land. I cannot afford to make an enemy of the whole town. I am sorry. Eli. Truly. Eli stopped his work and looked at his old friend. He saw the genuine regret in Silas's eyes, but he also saw the fear. Silas was a good man, but he was a man who bent to the will of the herd. Eli was not. I will not abandon her, Eli said. It was all the answer he needed to give. The final blow came 2 days later. They had ridden into town for supplies, a rare trip they made together. Clara was nervous, keeping her head down, but she had refused to stay hidden at the shack forever. As they were leaving the general store, a wagon pulled up in the middle of the street. A man in a severe black coat and a wide-brimmed hat climbed down. He was tall and carried himself with an air of unshakable authority. His face was handsome in a severe, chiseled way, but his eyes were cold, like chips of gray stone. The townspeople stopped what they were doing. Hats came off. Men and women alike nodded their heads in deference. "Good day, Reverend," they murmured. Eli felt Clara freeze beside him. All the color drained from her face. She made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat, and her hand, the one holding their small bag of flour, began to tremble so violently that the bag slipped from her grasp and burst on the dusty ground. It was him, Reverend Miller. The preacher's cold eyes scanned the street and landed on Clara. A slow, thin smile spread across his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling sense of possession. "Clara, my child," he said, his voice ringing out across the street, smooth and practiced, the voice of a man used to commanding attention. "There you are. I have been worried sick." He started toward them, his steps measured and confident. Eli instinctively moved to stand slightly in front of Clara, a silent shield. The preacher's eyes flickered to Eli, dismissing him as an irrelevance. "The Lord in His mercy has led me to you," the preacher continued, his voice dripping with false piety. "It is time to come home. It is time to repent for your wicked, willful ways." He stopped a few feet from them. The entire street was watching, a silent, captive audience. "This poor, misguided girl is my ward," he announced to the crowd. "I took her in when she had nothing. I gave her a home, a place in the church. And how did she repay my Christian charity? She allowed vanity and sin to enter her heart. She tempted a good man, tried to seduce him from his righteous path. And when she was discovered, she stole what little money I had and ran away, like a thief in the night." Every word was a lie, a carefully crafted poison dart aimed at Clara's heart. Eli could feel her shaking behind him. The sheriff, a portly man with a drooping mustache, hurried over, looking flustered. "Reverend Miller, sir, we did not know you were in town." "I came for what is mine. Sheriff," the preacher said, his voice hardening. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at Clara. "This child is my legal responsibility. She is a runaway. I demand she be handed over to my custody at once." A legal dispute, a man of God against a ruined girl and a nameless drifter. Eli knew which way the town's law, and its justice would lean. The sheriff looked from the preacher's stern, commanding face to Eli's cold, unyielding one. The preacher's gaze fell on Eli, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "And as for you, sir," he said, "I do not know what vile arrangement you have made with this fallen woman, but it ends now. You will release her to me." Eli did not move. He felt Clara's small hand clutch the back of his shirt, her fingers digging in like she was holding on for dear life. He looked straight into the preacher's cold, self-righteous eyes. The tension in the street was thick enough to choke on. The whole town was waiting to see what he would do. He let the silence stretch. Then he spoke, his voice low and clear and carrying the unmistakable weight of a vow. "She stays with me." Eli's words hung in the air, a line drawn in the dust of the street. "She stays with me." For a moment, the entire town seemed frozen. The wind kicked up a swirl of dirt, and the sun beat down with a hard, indifferent glare. Reverend Miller was the first to recover. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by a mask of cold fury. He was a man accustomed to obedience, to having his authority accepted without question. To be defied so publicly, by a nameless drifter, was an insult he could not abide. "Sheriff," the preacher said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command, "this man is interfering with my lawful guardianship. He is holding this child against her will, no doubt for his own sinful purposes. I demand you arrest him and return my ward to me." The sheriff, a man named Beasley, whose authority was clearly derived from the town's approval rather than his own spine, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at Eli, whose hand now rested loosely on the butt of his Colt. He looked at the preacher, whose face was a thundercloud of righteous anger. He looked at the crowd, whose collective gaze was hard with judgment. He chose the path of least resistance. "Now, McCall," the sheriff began, trying for a placating tone, "let's not have any trouble. The Reverend has a claim. We need to sort this out proper." "There is nothing to sort out," Eli said, his voice as flat and hard as the prairie in a drought. "The girl does not want to go with him." "She is a child, addled by sin and fear," the preacher boomed. "She does not know what she wants. I know what is best for her immortal soul." "Her soul seems to be doing fine," Eli retorted, his eyes never leaving the preacher's. "It is her body I am worried about." A gasp went through the crowd. To speak so disrespectfully to a man of the cloth was tantamount to blasphemy in Dry Creek. The tide of public opinion, which had never been in their favor, now turned into a hostile tsunami. "That is enough," Sheriff Beasley said, finding a sliver of courage. "There will be a hearing. Tomorrow morning, in my office. You will bring the girl, McCall, and Reverend Miller. You will state your case. Until then, there will be no more trouble." He puffed out his chest, as if this simple declaration was a great act of law enforcement. The preacher gave a stiff, angry nod. He shot one last look at Clara, a look of venomous possession, before turning on his heel and striding toward the town's only boarding house. The crowd slowly dispersed, casting dark, resentful glances at Eli and Clara, leaving them alone in the street with the burst sack of flour, a white stain in the dust. The ride back to the line shack was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive silence. Clara seemed to have shrunk into herself, her shoulders slumped, her face pale and devoid of expression. The flicker of life he had seen ignite within her over the past weeks had been extinguished, snuffed out by the preacher's return. She was once again the silent, terrified girl from the alley. Eli's heart ached with a cold, protective rage. The hearing the next morning was a farce. It was not a quest for truth, but a performance for the town's benefit. The sheriff's office was small and stuffy, smelling of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Sheriff Beasley sat behind his cluttered desk, looking important. Reverend Miller sat in a chair beside him, his hands folded over his Bible, the very picture of piety and wronged virtue. Eli stood against the back wall, his arms crossed over his chest. Clara sat in a small wooden chair in the center of the room, looking impossibly small and fragile. "All right," the sheriff began, clearing his throat. "Reverend Miller, state your case." The preacher launched into a long, eloquent speech. He spoke of his Christian duty, of taking in a poor orphan girl, of clothing and feeding her out of the goodness of his heart. He painted a picture of Clara as a troubled, ungrateful child, prone to lies and fantasies, who had fallen under the sway of a dark and rebellious spirit. His voice was smooth, confident, and utterly convincing to an audience that wanted to believe him. When he was finished, the sheriff turned to Clara. "Well, girl, what have you got to say for yourself? Did you or did you not run away from this good man's care?" Clara flinched at the sound of her own voice when she spoke, a small, trembling thing in the heavy silence. I ran away, yes." "And you stole from him?" the sheriff pressed. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I never stole anything." "She is lying," the preacher interjected smoothly. "The shock of her sinful life has muddled her memory." Eli took a step forward. "She is telling the truth." The sheriff shot him a glare. "Your turn will come. McCall, let the girl speak." He turned back to Clara, his expression softening into a false, paternalistic concern. "Clara, if you did not run away because of theft, then why? Why would you leave a good Christian home?" This was it, the moment for her to speak her truth. Eli watched, his entire body tense, as she took a deep, shuddering breath. He saw the struggle in her, the war between the terror that had kept her silent and the desperate need to be heard. He was not kind," she began, her voice cracking. "He would get angry, over small things, a dish that was not washed clean, a floor that was not swept properly." Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the floorboards, unable to look at either the sheriff or the preacher. "He would lock me in the pantry," she whispered, her voice growing fainter. "Sometimes for a whole day, with no food. It was dark, and he would hit me with his belt. He said it was to beat the sin out of me." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, and her gaze met Eli's. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You are doing fine. Keep going." "The night I left," she continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, "he was angrier than I had ever seen him. He locked me in my room for days. I heard him outside the door saying terrible things. I was so scared. When he finally left the house, I broke the window. I climbed out. I did not have my shoes. I ran. I ran all night." The room was silent. The raw, simple horror of her story hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, Eli thought it might be enough. The truth, spoken plainly, had to be enough. He was wrong. Reverend Miller let out a long, theatrical sigh, shaking his head with a look of profound sadness. "Oh, the poor, confused child," he said, his voice thick with pity. "Sheriff, you see what I am dealing with? Her fantasies have grown more elaborate. Her guilt has twisted her mind into inventing these terrible, slanderous stories to justify her own fall from grace." He stood up and walked over to Clara, who shrank away from him. He placed a hand on her head, a gesture that was meant to look like a blessing but was filled with a chilling possessiveness. "This is what happens when a young woman allows a corrupting influence into her life," he said, shooting a pointed look at Eli. "This man has clearly filled her head with these lies, preying on her weakness to turn her against me. The preacher denied everything. He twisted her every word. Her fear, he claimed, was guilt. Her silence was a sign of her deceit. Her story of abuse was a wicked fantasy, a seductress's attempt to ruin the reputation of a man of God." And the sheriff and the town he represented believed him. "I have heard enough," Beasley declared. "Reverend Miller, the girl is your ward. She will be returned to your custody." "No," Eli said, his voice a low growl. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. She was trembling like a leaf. McCall, you are treading on thin ice, the sheriff warned. You interfere with this, and I will have you in a cell for a month. Then you had better have a cell ready, Eli said. Just then, Clara pulled away from his touch. She wrapped her arms around herself, her face a mask of utter despair. The fight had gone out of her. She had spoken her truth, the hardest words she had ever uttered, and they had been cast back in her face as lies. The shame was a physical weight, bowing her head and shoulders. The light in her eyes went out. She had retreated back into that dark, silent place inside herself, a place where no one could reach her, not even him. The standoff was broken by a commotion outside. A group of men, led by Jedediah Stone, had gathered in the street. Their faces were angry, their voices a low, menacing rumble. "We do not want her kind here," Stone shouted. "Send the sinner away." The sheriff looked out the window, his face paling. He had lost control of the situation. He looked at Eli, then at the preacher, then at the growing crowd. "This has gone far enough," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We are leaving." He took Clara's arm. She did not resist. She moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes vacant. Before the sheriff or the preacher could react, Eli led her out of the office, pushing through the hostile crowd. Men jeered and spat at their feet, but no one dared to physically stop him. His face was a granite warning, and his hand never left his gun. They rode back to the line shack, the silence between them now a chasm of shame and defeat. Clara went inside without a word and lay down on the cot, facing the wall. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply ceased to be present, her spirit having fled to a place he could not follow. That night, the trouble came. They came with torches and whiskey-fueled courage, a mob of a dozen men from the town. Their lights bobbed in the darkness like angry fireflies, and their shouts echoed across the prairie. "Get out of our town, sinner! Give us the girl, McCall!" Eli stood in the darkened doorway of the shack, his rifle in his hands. He watched them come, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He could fight them. He could probably kill one or two before they brought him down. But it would not save Clara. It would only get them both killed. He backed into the shack. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent. "Get up! We have to go, now!" She did not respond. He went to her and gently but firmly pulled her to her feet. "Clara, listen to me. We are leaving. Through the back." He led her out the back window, into the deep shadows behind the shack. He had already saddled his horse, keeping it in the lean-to for just this possibility. He helped her up, then swung himself into the saddle behind her. With the shouts of the mob growing louder, he urged the horse into a silent trot, then a gallop, disappearing into the vast protective darkness of the open range. He led them west, toward the jagged, broken country of the canyons. It was rough terrain, a maze of rock and shadow, a place where a man could disappear if he knew the way. He knew it. For a week, they lived like ghosts. They found a hidden box canyon with a small spring and a stand of cottonwoods, a secret oasis shielded from the world by towering walls of red rock. Eli hunted, bringing back rabbits and quail, which they cooked over a small, smokeless fire late at night. He kept watch while Clara slept, his rifle always within reach. During the day, she was silent. She would sit for hours, staring at the canyon walls, her face a blank mask. She ate what he gave her. She drank from the spring, but she was an empty shell. He had failed her. He had brought her out of the storm, only to lead her into a fire. One night, the seventh night, the dam of her silence finally broke. The moon was a sliver of silver in a black sky littered with stars. The only sound was the crackle of their small campfire and the lonely cry of a coyote far away. Eli was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical. when he heard a small, choked sound. He looked up. Clara was sitting across the fire from him, her arms wrapped around her knees. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and ceaseless. Her whole body was shaking with suppressed sobs. He put down his rifle and went to her, kneeling in the dust beside her. He did not speak, he just waited. He did not just hit me," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. The words came in a torrent now, a confession held back for too long. That was not the worst of it. The worst was what he would say. He would read from the Bible, verses about wickedness and temptation, and he would look at me. He said I was filled with sin, that my body was a vessel for the devil, that a woman's purpose was to tempt a man from his holy path, and that it was his sacred duty to purify me. Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. A murderous rage, cold and pure, settled in his soul. He listened, his eyes burning with fury, but he did not interrupt. He did not move. He let her speak. "He said I owed him," she sobbed, her voice breaking completely, "for taking me in. He said the only way to cleanse my soul was to submit my body to a man of God. He never did it, but he talked about it. He described it. For months. He said it was my destiny, my penance. The night I ran, he told me that was the night, that my penance was due." She broke down completely then, her words dissolving into ragged, heartbroken sobs. She had finally given voice to the darkest, most shameful secret of her life. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight against his chest as she cried, her small body shaking against his. He rocked her gently, his hand stroking her tangled hair. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just held her. He absorbed her pain, her shame, her terror, into himself. He was the rock, and she was the storm that broke against him. After a long time, her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, utterly spent. In a voice so quiet he could barely hear it, a voice stripped bare of everything but a fragile, desperate hope. She whispered, "I am not what they say I am. Eli, I am not." He tightened his grip on her, pulling her closer, his lips brushing against her hair. He whispered back, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name, a vow spoken to her and to the silent, watchful stars. "I know." She shifted in his arms, lifting her face to his. In the flickering firelight, he saw the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the gratitude, the dawning of a feeling that was both terrifying and beautiful. She leaned in, her movements hesitant, innocent, and her lips, trembling and tear-stained, met his. The kiss was not one of passion, but of pure, unadulterated emotion. It was a thank you. It was a plea. It was the desperate, drowning grasp of a soul that had finally found a piece of solid ground in a raging sea. For a heartbeat, he allowed it. He felt the softness of her lips, the shudder that ran through her. But then, with a gentleness that cost him more than any act of violence ever had, he placed his fingers on her chin and broke the kiss. She looked at him, confusion and hurt clouding her eyes. He met her gaze, his own filled with a deep, aching tenderness. "Not now," he whispered, his voice rough. "Not like this. When you are broken and scared. You deserve more than that. Clara, you deserve more." The canyon had been a sanctuary, a place of stone and shadow that held Clara's whispered confession and kept it safe. But it was also a cage. Hiding was a kind of dying, a slow surrender to the idea that the world's lies were more powerful than her truth. They stayed for 2 more days after that night by the fire, 2 days of thick silence in which something between them had fundamentally shifted. The line he had drawn, not now, not like this, was not a rejection, but a promise. It was a promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, a future where she was more than just a survivor. It was Clara who spoke of it first, her voice quiet but firm as they watched the sunrise paint the canyon walls in hues of rose and gold. "I cannot hide forever. Eli, running is what he expects. It is what makes me look guilty." Eli looked at her, truly looked at her. The fear was still there, deep in her eyes, but it was no longer the all-consuming terror that had paralyzed her. It was a smaller thing now, a shadow she could stand beside instead of being lost within. Her time in the wilderness, her confession spoken aloud, had forged a new and fragile strength within her. He saw it, and he knew she was right. "Then we go back," he said, his voice a low rumble of resolve. "We do not run, we fight." Their return to Dry Creek was a silent declaration of war. They rode not with the furtive haste of fugitives, but with the slow, deliberate pace of people who had a right to be there. They did not stop at the edge of town. They rode straight down the main street. Windows parted, doors opened a crack. The town watched their approach with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The sinner and her keeper had come back from the wilderness. Eli left Clara with the horse at the livery stable. His only instruction, a quiet, "Stay here." He walked alone to the sheriff's office. He did not knock. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his presence filling the small, dusty room. Sheriff Beasley was at his desk, laboriously writing a report. He looked up, and his face, already fleshy and prone to sweat, went pale. "McCall, I thought you had left." "You thought wrong," Eli said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I am here to demand an investigation into the actions of Reverend Miller." Beasley licked his lips, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "Now, see here. We had a hearing. The matter is settled. The girl is his ward." "The girl was his prisoner," Eli corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "He beat her. He starved her. He threatened her with things no man, let alone a man of God, should ever speak of. He is not a shepherd. He is a wolf." The sheriff flapped a hand dismissively, though his gaze would not meet Eli's. "Those are just her stories. McCall, hysterical fantasies. You have no proof." "Her bruises were proof. The terror in her eyes was proof," Eli countered, taking a step closer to the desk. "You are the law in this town. Beasley, are you going to do your job? Or are you going to let that man continue to hide his sins behind a Bible?" "The Reverend has influence," the sheriff mumbled, his voice barely audible. He was sweating freely now. "The town council, the ranchers, they all respect him. I cannot just go accusing a man of his standing based on the word of a troubled girl." "So you are going to do nothing," Eli stated. It was not a question. "My hands are tied," Beasley insisted, finding a pathetic shred of defiance. "The town looks to him for moral guidance. To go against him would be to go against the whole community. It would cause chaos." "Sometimes chaos is what you need to burn out a sickness," Eli said, his voice laced with contempt. He looked at the man behind the desk, a man so terrified of upsetting the delicate balance of lies that held his town together that he would sacrifice a young girl to maintain it. He saw the truth then. The law would not help them. The town would look away. They had already chosen their side. Eli turned without another word and walked out, leaving the sheriff to his cowardice. He found Reverend Miller holding court on the porch of the boarding house, surrounded by a small group of the town's more influential citizens. They were laughing at some story the preacher was telling, their faces full of admiration and deference. Eli did not break his stride. He walked straight up the steps, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. The laughter died. The men turned to look at him, their expressions hardening. The preacher's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold annoyance. "McCall," Miller said, his tone dripping with condescension. "To what do we owe this unpleasant intrusion?" Eli ignored the other men. He stopped a few feet from the preacher, his gaze locked on the man's cold, gray eyes. "I am giving you one chance to tell the truth," Eli said, his voice low and clear. yet carrying to every corner of the porch. Confess what you did to Clara Bell. Tell these men how you abused her, how you tormented her. Tell them, and then leave this town and never come back." A shocked silence fell over the group. The preacher let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You are insane. This is slander. This girl has poisoned your mind with her wicked lies." "I am not talking to the girl," Eli said. "I am talking to you. I am challenging you. You claim to be a man of God, a man of honor. I say you are a liar and a coward. If you have any courage at all, you will face me, man to man. A duel." The word hung in the air. A shocking, archaic thing. Duels were for hot-headed youths and old-world aristocrats, not for a civilized town and a man of the cloth. But in the West, it was still the final arbiter when law and reason failed. It was a demand for a reckoning. The preacher's face went white. The color drained from his lips. He was, as Eli had suspected, a profound coward. His power came from the pulpit and the weight of public opinion, not from the strength of his own character. "This is barbaric," Miller sputtered, looking to the other men for support. "I will not lower myself to such savagery." "I did not think you would," Eli said, his voice full of contempt. Just then, a man who had been leaning against the porch rail, silent and watchful throughout the exchange, pushed himself into a standing position. He was not large, but he moved with a fluid, deadly grace. He had a lean, hungry look, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, as empty and cold as a winter sky. A gun was strapped low on his hip, the leather worn smooth from practice. He was a hired gun. Eli had seen his type before. "The Reverend does not fight his own battles," the man said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "He pays me to fight them for him. The name is Frank. If you want a duel, you have one. With me." Eli looked from the hired gun to the preacher, who was now hiding behind the man's shoulder, a look of smug relief on his face. This was how it would be. He would not get his justice from the true source of the poison, but he would have to cut down the snake that guarded it. "The street?" Eli said. "In 5 minutes." He turned and walked down the steps without waiting for an answer. The town seemed to sense what was coming. People vanished from the street, retreating into doorways and behind windows. A terrible, expectant silence fell over Dry Creek. Eli went to the livery. Clara was there, her face a pale oval of fear in the shadows. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Stay here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what you hear, you stay here. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. He checked his Colt, the familiar weight of comfort in his hand. He took a deep breath, the scent of hay and horse calming his nerves. He was not a gunslinger. He did not seek this kind of violence, but he would not run from it, not when Clara's honor was on the line. He walked out into the empty street. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the dust. At the far end of the street, Frank was waiting, a black silhouette against the glare. They began to walk toward each other, their steps slow and measured, eating up the distance until they were 50 yards apart. Eli's world narrowed to the man in front of him. He felt the sweat trickle down his temples. He saw the way Frank's hand hovered over his gun, his fingers twitching slightly. He heard the frantic beating of his own heart. There were no words. There was no signal. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding. And then there was movement. It was a blur. Frank was fast, his hand a streak of motion as he drew and fired. The world exploded in a roar of sound and a flash of fire. Eli felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left side, just above his hip. The force of the bullet spun him half around, and his leg buckled. He fell to one knee, a grunt of agony escaping his lips. But he was not down. Through a red haze of pain, he saw Frank standing there, a thin smile on his lips, already bringing his gun up for the killing shot. Eli's training, the hard-won instincts of a man who had survived a war, took over. He raised his own Colt, his arm steady despite the fire consuming his side. He aimed. He squeezed the trigger. His shot was true. The bullet caught Frank square in the chest, throwing him backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. He landed in a heap in the dust and did not move again. A collective gasp went through the unseen audience. Eli saw a movement on the porch of the boarding house. It was Reverend Miller. The preacher's face was a mask of disbelief and terror. He looked at the body of his hired gun, then at Eli, who was still on one knee, his gun smoking. The preacher turned and fled, scrambling into the boarding house like a rat seeking a hole. He was broken. His power in Dry Creek was gone, exposed as a fraud in a single violent moment. Eli tried to stand, but the strength had gone out of his legs. The world began to spin, the edges of his vision turning dark. He heard a cry, a single, anguished sound. "Eli!" He saw Clara running toward him, her face a blur of motion. Then the dust rose up to meet him, and the world went black. He woke to the familiar scent of hay. Shafts of dusty sunlight streamed through the gaps in the stable walls, illuminating the space in a soft, hazy glow. He was lying on a bed of fresh straw, his head pillowed on a saddle. He tried to sit up, and a bolt of agony shot through his side, forcing him back down with a groan. "Do not move," a soft voice commanded. Clara was kneeling beside him. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear and focused. She had a bucket of water and a pile of torn white cloth beside her, part of her own dress. He realized she had cleaned his wound and bandaged it tightly. He was in the same stable where he had first found her crying, a lifetime ago. But the girl kneeling beside him now was not the same one he had found in the mud. The terror was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective determination. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she gently dabbed his forehead with a cool, wet cloth. "He needed to be faced," Eli rasped, his throat dry. "You could have been killed." He looked at her, at the raw courage that had brought her back to this town, that had made her speak her truth in the face of their hatred. "You were brave today, Clara, braver than any of them." She shook her head, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I was just tired of running." She tended to him for the rest of the day, her touch gentle and sure. She brought him water, spoonful by spoonful. She sat with him in the quiet, dusty silence of the stable, a guardian in the place where she had once been a victim. That night, the pain in his side receded to a dull, throbbing ache. The stable was dark, save for a single lantern she had lit, its golden light casting long, dancing shadows. He was weak, vulnerable in a way he had not been in years, and in his weakness, a different kind of strength bloomed in her. She was no longer just a survivor, and he was no longer just a protector. They were simply a man and a woman, stripped bare by violence and truth. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and gently brushed the hair back from his forehead. Her touch was feather-light, but it sent a shock wave through him. He saw the question in her eyes, the same raw, vulnerable emotion he had seen in the canyon. But this time, it was different. It was not born of desperation. It was a choice. He did not move. He did not speak. He let her lead. She leaned down, her face illuminated by the soft lantern light. She was beautiful, he thought, with a profound, soul-deep beauty that had been forged in pain and fire. She touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his feverish skin, and then she kissed him. It was a slow, emotionally raw kiss, a kiss of shared sorrow and newfound hope. It tasted of tears and dust and the promise of a dawn that was yet to come. It was a sacred thing, a silent vow exchanged in the heart of the stable that had witnessed both the beginning of her despair and the start of her healing. He felt the last of his own carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. He lifted a hand, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. He whispered her name, the sound a ragged, desperate prayer against her lips. "Clara?" In the morning, he woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere in the town. For a moment, a deep sense of peace settled over him. The pain was still there, but it was a distant thing. He felt Clara's presence beside him, a warm and comforting weight. He opened his eyes. She was gone. The space beside him was empty. A cold dread, sharper than any bullet wound, pierced his heart. He pushed himself up, ignoring the protest of his body. On the crate beside the straw bed, there was a piece of folded paper, weighted down with a stone. His hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was neat but unsteady. "Eli, you saved me. You gave me back my voice, and you fought for my honor when no one else would. I will never be able to repay you, but I cannot be the reason your life is ruined. As long as I am with you, you will be an outcast. You will be a target. You bled for me. I will not let you die for me. They were wrong about me, but they were right about one thing. I bring trouble. Please, do not follow me. Forget me. Live your life in peace. You deserve more. Clara." He crushed the paper in his fist. A wave of fury and despair washed over him. She did not understand. She was not the trouble. She was the reason. She was the purpose he had been searching for when he first rode into this God-forsaken town. Peace was not a place. It was a person. He gritted his teeth against the pain and forced himself to his feet. Every movement was agony, but it was nothing compared to the agony of losing her. He stumbled out of the stable and into the morning light. He found his horse, saddled and waiting, with a canteen of water tied to the horn, a final, practical act of caring. He pulled himself into the saddle, a wave of dizziness threatening to overwhelm him. He looked down the empty street of Dry Creek, a town that had scorned her, a town he was now leaving behind forever. He looked west, toward the vast, unforgiving expanse of the frontier. She had a head start, but she was on foot. Her trail would be easy to follow. He nudged the horse forward, his body on fire, his heart set on a single, unwavering course. He was going after her. The world had been reduced to three things: the searing pain in his side, the relentless sun overhead, and the faint signs of her passage on the unforgiving earth. Eli McCall rode with his teeth gritted, a constant, low-grade agony radiating from the tight bandage Clara had wrapped around his torso. Every jolt of the horse was a fresh wave of fire, but the pain was a welcome anchor. It kept him sharp. It reminded him of what he stood to lose. He tracked her not like a hunter, but like a pilgrim following the trail of a lost saint. She left little trace. She was a ghost on the landscape, a whisper in the wind. But he had learned her in the quiet moments at the line shack, in the desperate week they had spent in the canyon. He knew to look for the signs others would miss. He found the impression of a small, worn shoe in the dust near a shallow creek bed. He found a place where she had rested, a small circle of flattened grass in the meager shade of a mesquite tree. He was not just following her footsteps. He was following the shape of her sorrow, of her desperate flight. The desert was a vast, empty canvas of cracked earth and shimmering heat. He rode through wind that felt like a furnace blast, carrying dust that coated his throat and stung his eyes. He passed through dying towns, collections of weathered shacks where hope had long since dried up and blown away. In one such place, a settlement with more graves than living souls. He spoke to an old woman running a near-empty general store. "Did you see a young woman pass through?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Traveling alone, dark blonde hair, sad eyes." The old woman looked him over, her gaze lingering on the dark stain of blood that had seeped through his shirt. "Saw her," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Day or two ago. Bought a small loaf of bread and a canteen of water. Paid with a silver button. A pretty one. Looked like it came off a good coat." Eli's hand went to his own trail coat, the one he had given Clara, the one she had left behind at the shack. He knew which button she meant. He thanked the woman, bought what little supplies she had, and rode on. The small clue, a burning coal in his heart, fueling his resolve. He was on the right path. His journey was a blur of pain and persistence. Days bled into nights. He slept in the saddle or for an hour or two by a cold camp, his dreams filled with the image of her face, the memory of her tear-streaked kiss. He thought of her letter, of her selfless, misguided attempt to save him. "You deserve more." The words were a brand on his soul. She was wrong. She was what he deserved. She was the only thing he had ever truly wanted. She had not ruined him. The world had tried to ruin him long ago, in the smoke and chaos of a war that had stolen his youth and his faith. He had been a ghost long before he met her. It was she, with her quiet suffering and her defiant spark of life, who had made him feel solid again. She had not ruined him. She had saved him. After nearly 2 weeks of relentless pursuit, when his body was at the ragged edge of its endurance, he saw it, a new settlement, nestled in a valley where a thin ribbon of a river gave life to a stretch of cottonwood trees. It was not a town yet, just a hopeful collection of new lumber and canvas tents, a place where people were building futures instead of dwelling on past failures, a place someone might go to start over. He rode in slowly, a stranger caked in dust and dried blood, drawing curious stares. He asked after a place a woman might find work. A man pointed him toward a large tent at the end of the main path, where a widow named Mrs. Gable had set up a seamstress business, mending the rough clothes of prospectors and homesteaders. Eli dismounted, his legs unsteady beneath him. He tied his horse and stood for a long moment, looking at the tent. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs. What if he was wrong? What if she was not here? What if she saw him and ran again? He pushed the doubts down. He had not come this far to be turned back by fear. He pulled back the canvas flap and stepped inside. The air was warm and smelled of lye soap and hot irons. Bolts of calico and denim were stacked on rough-hewn tables. And there, sitting on a stool in the corner, her head bent over a torn canvas shirt, was Clara. She was calling herself Belle now. He would learn later, a name that meant beauty, chosen perhaps in defiance of the filth she had been called. She was thinner than when he had last seen her, the bones of her face more prominent, and in her eyes. When she looked up, startled by his entrance, he saw it still, that deep, lingering shadow of shame. It was a wound that had not yet begun to heal. Her face went pale. The needle slipped from her fingers, clattering unheard onto the wooden floor. She stared at him, her lips parted in a silent gasp, a mixture of terror and a desperate, unbelievable hope dawning in her eyes. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence said everything. He walked toward her, each step an effort, his body screaming in protest. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He looked down at her, at the woman who had run from him to save him, the woman who thought she was a ruinous burden. And then, with all the strength he had left, Eli McCall dropped to one knee in the dust and sawdust of the seamstress tent. He reached out and took her small, trembling hand in his. He looked up into her tear-filled eyes and spoke the words that had been his mantra across 1,000 miles of desolate wasteland. "You did not ruin me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You saved me." It was all it took. The dam of her composure, so carefully constructed, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound, heart-wrenching relief that it seemed to shake the very tent poles. She broke down, her head falling forward, her tears splashing onto his hand, onto the floor, washing away weeks of fear and loneliness and shame. He knelt there, holding her hand, and let her cry until there were no tears left. When her sobs finally quieted, he spoke again, his voice a low, steady vow in the stillness of the tent. "I want my name next to yours. Clara, I want you to be my wife." He squeezed her hand gently. "The world can call you a sinner. They can call you anything they want, but I will call you my bride." She looked at him then, her face a mess of tears and dawning wonder, and she whispered the one word that would remake both their worlds. Yes. They were married 3 days later, as the sun was setting behind the distant mountains. There was no church, no preacher, no guests. Their only witnesses were the vast, silent desert and the wind that whispered through the sagebrush. Eli stood tall, the pain in his side a dull echo of the battle he had won. Clara stood beside him, wearing a simple dress of pale blue cotton she had made herself. She looked not like a sinner, not like a victim, but like a woman who was finally, tentatively, claiming her own future. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged vows, simple words whispered into the dusk, promises of faithfulness and protection and a shared life, for better or for worse. In that moment, under the endless star-dusted sky, they were not outcasts. They were the only two people in the entire world. A month later, a traveling merchant passed through their settlement, bringing news from the east. He spoke of a town called Dry Creek and a scandal involving a preacher named Miller. It seemed that after Eli and Clara had left, the preacher's true nature had begun to surface. He had tried to exert his authority over another family, and when the father had stood up to him, the preacher's carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Other stories began to emerge, whispers that grew into accusations. The town, forced to confront the ugliness it had refused to see, had finally turned on him. The law, so useless before, had been forced to act. Reverend Miller had fled in the night, a disgraced fugitive. Clara's name was cleared. Her truth had come to light. She and Eli listened to the news with a quiet sense of vindication, but it did not change their plans. Dry Creek was a scar on their past, a place of ghosts and bitter memories. They never returned. They used the money Eli had saved from his years on the trail to buy a small piece of land by the river that flowed through their valley. It was a modest plot, but the soil was rich and the water ran clear. They built a small ranch, a sturdy, honest house made of cottonwood logs and hard work. They bought a few dozen head of cattle and a pair of good horses. They built a life, piece by piece. A life defined not by the cruelty of others, but by the quiet strength of their own two hands. The healing was a slow, quiet process. The past did not simply vanish. There were still nights when Clara would cry out in her sleep, her dreams haunted by the shadow of a man in a black coat and the memory of a locked room. On those nights, Eli would wake and simply hold her, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the darkness. He would stroke her hair and wait for the storm to pass. He would lean down and whisper in her ear, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "They were wrong about you." And she would turn in his arms, the tears still damp on her cheeks, and a small, tremulous smile would touch her lips in the moonlight. She would look up at him, her eyes full of a love that was deeper and stronger than any pain. "You were not," she would whisper back. We are so grateful you joined us for this story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.